Part 1. What was it like to be the most unwanted child in royal history? Hey everyone, tonight we're drifting back into the strange and often uncomfortable world of royal families. So, dim the lights, settle into your favorite chair, and get comfortable. Tonight's journey takes us into palaces filled with velvet curtains, gold decorations, endless servants, and people who somehow manage to be deeply miserable despite possessing nearly everything money could buy. Because, as it turns out, being born royal did not automatically make life pleasant. In fact, for some children, it made life considerably worse. We'll spend tonight exploring what it was like to be the unwanted child of history's most powerful families, the princes and princesses who arrived in the world only to discover that their parents had hoped for someone else, perhaps a son instead of a daughter, perhaps a healthier child, perhaps a smarter child, or perhaps simply any child who wasn't them. And while most ordinary families could quietly complain at home, royal families had a remarkable tendency to make their disappointments everyone's problem. So close your eyes, take a slow breath, and let's wander into one of the grandest palaces in Europe, a place where one little girl was born into unimaginable wealth and almost immediately became a disappointment. Her name was Maria Anna of Spain, although history often remembers her brother more clearly, which was part of the problem. Maria Anna entered the world in the 17th century as a member of the powerful Spanish branch of the House of Habsburg. Now, whenever the Habsburgs appear in a story, it is generally safe to assume that things are about to become genetically complicated. The family spent generations marrying cousins, nieces, uncles, and practically anyone who shared the family portrait. Naturally, this created problems, many problems. But before we get to those, let's focus on Maria Anna. Her father desperately wanted a healthy male heir. European monarchs spent an astonishing amount of time worrying about heirs. Entire kingdoms could panic if the royal nursery failed to produce a suitable boy. Wars started over less. Actually, wars started over exactly that. So when Maria Anna arrived and turned out to be a daughter, celebrations were somewhat restrained. Not absent, just restrained. Imagine being welcomed into the world with the enthusiasm of someone receiving socks for their birthday. Useful enough, but not quite what everyone hoped for. Her younger brother eventually arrived and instantly became the center of attention. Everything revolved around him: his education, his future, his health, his meals, his clothing, his ability to breathe correctly. Royal courts could become obsessed with heirs to an almost comical degree. Maria Anna spent much of her childhood existing in the shadows of expectations placed upon others. This wasn't unusual. Many royal daughters essentially functioned as future marriage agreements, living diplomatic documents, highly decorated bargaining chips. They received educations. They learned etiquette. They mastered courtly behavior. But everyone understood their ultimate purpose. One day they would be married off somewhere politically useful, whether they liked it or not. Usually the second option. And so Maria Anna grew up knowing that her future had largely been decided before she could walk. Not exactly encouraging. Yet compared with some royal children, she actually got off relatively lightly. Let's drift northward now, toward England, toward a young princess who became unwanted for a rather different reason. Her name was Mary Tudor, the future Queen Mary the First. And from the moment she was born, Her father's feelings about her changed repeatedly depending on circumstances, which was unfortunate because her father happened to be Henry VIII, a man who approached family relationships with all the stability of a weather vane during a hurricane. When Mary was born in 1516, Henry was initially pleased. She was healthy. She was intelligent. She survived infancy. All significant achievements in the 16th century. But there was one problem. She wasn't a son. At first, Henry convinced himself that sons would follow. Surely more children would arrive. Surely destiny would cooperate. Surely everything would work out. It did not. Years passed. No surviving sons appeared. Henry became increasingly frustrated, then increasingly desperate, then increasingly irrational. Eventually, he convinced himself that his marriage was cursed. Naturally, he responded by dismantling centuries of religious tradition and launching one of history's most famous marital crises. Because of course he did. Mary watched her parents' marriage collapse in spectacular fashion. One day she was a beloved princess. The next she found herself declared illegitimate. Her title disappeared. Her status vanished. Servants left. Privileges evaporated. People who once bowed deeply suddenly became noticeably less enthusiastic. Imagine being informed that your entire identity has changed because your father decided he preferred a different wife. Mary spent years enduring humiliation and uncertainty. At times she was separated from her mother. At times pressured to deny her own legitimacy. At times treated almost as a political inconvenience, which, from Henry's perspective, she unfortunately was. The saddest part is that Mary genuinely loved her father, even when he repeatedly caused misery. Children often seek approval from parents who refuse to provide it. Royal children were no different, except their disappointments unfolded before entire kingdoms. Years later, Mary would become queen herself. Yet the wounds from childhood never fully disappeared. The lonely princess remained hidden beneath the crown, and perhaps that is one reason her reign became so troubled. Now let's move toward France, where another unwanted royal child experienced a quieter, but equally painful existence. This child was known simply as Madame Royale, the daughter of King Louis XVI and Queen Marie Antoinette. If those names sound familiar, it is because their story ends rather badly. Revolutions have a tendency to do that. As a young girl, Madame Royale lived amid extraordinary luxury. Yet even in Versailles, attention often focused elsewhere. Royal families valued sons. Heirs mattered. Succession mattered. Politics mattered. Daughters frequently occupied secondary positions. Not entirely ignored, just never quite first. Imagine spending childhood inside one of the most extravagant palaces ever, constructed and still feeling overlooked. Versailles excelled at many things. Emotional warmth was not among them. Children often lived separately from parents. Nurses handled daily care. Formal etiquette governed interactions. Even family life became a performance. A child could feel lonely while surrounded by hundreds of people, which sounds exhausting, and probably was. As political tensions increased across France, the family's situation deteriorated. The little princess witnessed fear replacing luxury, whispers replacing celebrations. Eventually, imprisonment replaced palace life entirely. The royal family was confined together while revolution transformed the nation outside. For Madame Royale, childhood became an extended lesson in uncertainty. One by one, family members disappeared. Some died, some were executed, some simply vanished from her life. By the time she emerged years later, she was one of the few survivors. A princess who had once been overlooked became the final living reminder of an entire fallen dynasty. History can be strangely cruel like that. Now let's wander eastward, toward Russia, toward one of the most famous unwanted royal children of all, Grand Duchess Olga Nikolaevna, the eldest daughter of Tsar Nicholas II. When Olga was born in 1895, the Russian Empire celebrated. Briefly, then came disappointment. The imperial family desperately wanted a son, a future czar, an heir, a continuation of the dynasty. Instead, they received a daughter, then another daughter, then another, then another, for daughters in total. Each arrival greeted with increasingly awkward enthusiasm. The girls themselves were intelligent, affectionate, and widely admired. Yet the court remained obsessed with the absence of a boy. Imagine growing up surrounded by people constantly discussing the child they wished existed instead. Eventually, a son did arrive, Alexei, and instantly the entire family's attention shifted toward him. This was partly because he was heir, and partly because he suffered from hemophilia, a dangerous inherited disorder. The result, once again, of generations of royal intermarriage. The Romanovs and Habsburgs seemed determined to demonstrate the consequences of treating family trees like circles. Olga loved her brother deeply, yet she could not avoid noticing where priorities lay. Everything revolved around protecting Alexei. His health dominated family life. His future dominated political discussion. His survival dominated everyone's fears. Meanwhile, the daughters occupied supporting roles. Important, beloved, yet secondary. Always secondary. Olga gradually became thoughtful and melancholy. Letters reveal a young woman who understood responsibility, but often felt trapped by circumstances beyond her control. She longed for a simpler existence. Many royals did. Ironically, people with unlimited resources frequently dreamed about ordinary life. Perhaps because ordinary life occasionally allows personal freedom, royal life often does not. As adulthood approached, Olga still had little control over her future. Marriage discussions floated around her constantly. Political calculations never stopped. Then revolution arrived, and every plan disappeared. The Romanov story eventually ended in tragedy. But long before that final chapter, Olga had already experienced something many children understand all too well. The feeling that expectations belonged to someone else, and she simply happened to stand nearby. As we begin drifting toward the close of tonight's first part, a pattern emerges. These children possessed crowns, titles, servants, and magnificent homes. Yet many lacked something far more valuable: the simple certainty of being wanted. History often teaches us about kings and queens, battles and treaties, victories and defeats. But hidden beneath those events were children. Children trying to earn affection, trying to meet impossible expectations, trying to become people their parents might finally appreciate. Sometimes they succeeded, often they did not. And for royal children, failure could echo across an entire lifetime. So for now, Let the palace corridors grow quiet. Let the candles burn low. And let these forgotten princes and princesses drift softly into the darkness of history once more. In the next part, we'll meet even more royal children who discovered that being born into greatness often came with an astonishing shortage of kindness. And unfortunately, their stories become even stranger. Part 2. What happened to royal mistresses when kings lost interest? The palace is quiet again. The candles are burning low. The servants have finished their endless polishing, dusting, carrying, bowing, and pretending not to hear royal arguments through very thin walls. And tonight, we're drifting into a different corner of royal life, a place that was glittering and comfortable right up until it wasn't. We're talking about royal mistresses, the women who found themselves at the center of a king's attention for a while. And that last part is important because royal affection was often temporary, very temporary. Kings were famous for many things: military campaigns, political schemes, expensive wardrobes, questionable decisions, and an almost supernatural ability to become bored. One year, a woman might be the most influential person at court. The next year, she could find herself packed into a carriage and sent somewhere nobody could pronounce. Royal favor came quickly and disappeared even faster. So settle in, and let's begin with one of the most famous royal mistresses in European history, a woman named Diane de Poitiers, who somehow managed to accomplish the nearly impossible. She remained influential even as she grew older, something that terrified younger rivals. Diane became the mistress of King Henry II of France. Now here's where things become slightly unusual. Diane was around 20 years older than Henry, which was not the standard arrangement. Usually kings preferred younger companions. Henry, however, adored Diane, absolutely adored her. He wore her colors during tournaments. He placed her initials alongside his own. He listened to her advice. He trusted her judgment. And perhaps most importantly, he continued doing so year after year. For decades, at court, Diane became almost queen-like in influence. The actual queen, Catherine de' Medici, had to watch this entire situation unfold from the sidelines. Patiently, very patiently, the sort of patience that develops when you're planning for the future. Because Catherine understood something important. Kings do not live forever. Eventually, Henry died following a jousting accident, which sounds dramatic. But medieval and early modern kings had an extraordinary talent for finding creative ways to injure themselves. A splinter from a lance entered his eye. The injury proved fatal, and suddenly everything changed. Almost overnight, Diane's position evaporated. The king who protected her was gone. The queen who had endured years of humiliation was now in charge. Catherine acted swiftly, very swiftly. Diane lost property, lost influence, lost her place at court, lost access to power. She wasn't imprisoned. She wasn't executed. But she was removed. Firmly. The message was clear. Thank you for your years of service. Please leave. Immediately. Compared with many royal favorites, Diane actually got a relatively comfortable ending. She retired to her estates, lived quietly, and survived long enough to watch younger generations create entirely new scandals. Not everyone was so fortunate. Let's drift over to England, a kingdom that somehow managed to make royal romance even more dangerous. which is impressive because the competition was fierce. There we find in Bullen, although calling her merely a mistress feels incomplete, and occupied a strange position. She began as the object of Henry VIII's obsession and ended as his queen. Briefly, very briefly, at first Henry pursued and relentlessly. Letters survive showing his fascination. He wanted her attention. He wanted her affection. He wanted her agreement. And most importantly, he wanted her to provide something his first wife had not: a surviving son. Everything seemed to revolve around sons. Kings discussed sons the way modern people discuss internet connections, always worried about reliability, always wanting a stronger one, and eventually became queen. A remarkable achievement. For a moment, she stood at the very center of English politics. Yet royal affection is often tied to expectations, and expectations can become dangerous, and gave birth to a daughter, the future Queen Elizabeth I, a tremendously important historical figure, but not the son Henry desired. Pregnancies followed, miscarriages occurred, tensions increased. The king's attention wandered, as it frequently did. New women appeared, new possibilities emerged, and suddenly, and found herself experiencing the terrifying reality faced by many royal favorites. The king had become interested in someone else. When ordinary relationships end, people usually experience sadness, perhaps embarrassment, perhaps awkward conversations. When royal relationships ended, people occasionally lost their heads. Literally, Henry's government accused Anne of adultery, treason, and various other crimes. Historians continue debating the accusations. Many view them as politically motivated. Regardless, the outcome remained the same. Anne was arrested, tried, condemned, and executed. The king moved on remarkably quickly, which seems to have been one of his defining talents. The lesson was harsh. At court, affection could look permanent, until it wasn't. Now let's slow our pace and wander toward Versailles, the enormous French palace where influence flowed like perfume and vanished just as easily. There we meet Madame de Pompadour, one of the most successful royal mistresses in history. King Louis XV became fascinated by her. Yet Madame de Pompadour understood something many others missed. Beauty fades, youth fades, royal attention drifts. So she adapted. Instead of relying entirely on romance, she became indispensable politically. She advised the king, supported artistic projects, influenced appointments, managed court relationships. She transformed herself from companion into institution, which was considerably safer. When their romantic relationship cooled, her position remained surprisingly secure, because Louis genuinely valued her company. More importantly, he valued her usefulness. In royal courts, usefulness often lasts longer than passion. An unfortunate truth, but a truth nonetheless. Madame de Pompadour remained influential for years after their romantic connection faded. Many rivals hoped to replace her. Most failed. She had effectively rewritten the rules. Still, even she understood how fragile her position truly was. Every court favorite lived with uncertainty. Every smile from the king mattered. Every rumor mattered. Every whispered conversation mattered. Imagine spending decades wondering whether tomorrow might bring disaster. Exhausting, absolutely exhausting. Now let's drift further into the 18th century, toward another famous figure, Madame du Barry, the final great mistress of Louis XV. Unlike Pompadour, du Barry faced enormous hostility. Court aristocrats looked down on her background. They considered her unsuitable, unworthy, embarrassingly common, which, in aristocratic language, was among the worst possible offenses. For several years, however, none of this mattered. The king adored her, and as long as he did, criticism remained limited. People complained quietly, behind closed doors, at a safe distance. Then Louis XV died, and instantly her protection vanished. Notice how often this happens. One royal funeral could completely transform someone's future. The new regime had little interest in preserving her influence. She was removed from court, exiled from the center of power, not destroyed immediately, just discarded, like furniture no longer matching the decor. Yet history wasn't finished with her. The French Revolution arrived years later. Revolutionaries had little affection for symbols of royal luxury. Du Barry eventually faced arrest, trial, execution. The same society that once envied her jewels now viewed them as evidence. A dramatic reversal, though perhaps not entirely surprising. Royal favor had elevated her. An association with royalty ultimately contributed to her downfall. As the night grows deeper, let's consider a quieter truth about these women. Many entered court young, very young, often teenagers. They arrived in worlds filled with wealth and danger. Every conversation carried hidden meaning. Every friendship could become political. Every success attracted rivals. Every mistake attracted enemies. And beneath all the luxury remained a simple reality. Their security depended heavily upon another person's interest. A king's attention could open doors, provide estates, create titles, offer influence. But attention is not stability. Attention shifts. People change. Circumstances change. And courts changed faster than almost anywhere else. Some former mistresses entered convents. Others married. Some retired comfortably. Others disappeared into poverty. A few became political players in their own right. Many simply faded from public memory, which may actually have been the happiest outcome, because history tends to remember dramatic endings. The quiet survivors often receive less attention, yet perhaps they were the lucky ones. Imagine escaping court, escaping endless intrigue, escaping constant scrutiny, escaping the exhausting task of remaining interesting to a monarch. There are worse fates, far worse. And so tonight's story leaves us with an oddly familiar lesson. Royal mistresses appeared to possess everything: luxury, influence, attention, access. Yet many stood on remarkably unstable ground. Their fortunes rose and fell according to emotions they could never fully control. For a season, they occupied the center of the world. Then someone new arrived, a younger face, a different personality, a fresh distraction, and the spotlight moved elsewhere. The palace continued. The court continued. History continued, while they quietly discovered what happened when kings lost interest. For some, it meant retirement. For others, exile. For a few, tragedy. And for nearly all of them, it meant learning that royal favor was one of the most valuable things in the world, and one of the least reliable. So let the palace corridors empty once more. Let the music fade into the distance, and let the former favorites drift softly into history, because waiting just beyond them are even stranger royal lives. lives filled with rivalries, disappointments, and spectacularly poor decisions. And we'll wander into those stories next. Part 3. What was it like to be the last person awake in an ancient city? The palace has finally fallen silent. The kings have stopped making questionable decisions for the evening. The mistresses have retired behind heavy wooden doors. The courtiers have finished gossiping about one another. And now, as midnight settles over the world, we're leaving royal bedrooms behind. Instead, we're stepping outside, into streets lit only by moonlight, into cities where darkness was not an inconvenience. It was a fact of life. Tonight, we're going to discover what it was like to be the last person awake in an ancient city. Because long before electric lights, 24-hour convenience stores, glowing phone screens, and people deciding that 3 in the morning was the perfect time to watch documentaries about medieval sheep taxes, cities became astonishingly dark after sunset. Most people simply went to bed, not because they were especially disciplined, not because they followed wellness routines, but because there wasn't much else to do. When your primary light source involves setting something on fire, bedtime arrives surprisingly early. Yet not everyone slept. Someone always remained awake. Someone always walked the streets. Someone always guarded the gates. Someone always listened to the sounds of a sleeping city. And tonight, we'll spend a few quiet hours beside them. Let's begin in ancient Rome, the largest city the world had ever seen. A sprawling maze of temples, apartments, bathhouses, markets, workshops, and narrow winding streets. During daylight hours, Rome was noisy beyond imagination. Merchants shouted, animals wandered, carts rattled over stone roads. Politicians argued, children played, builders hammered, vendors advertised. Everyone seemed determined to make as much noise as humanly possible, which makes Roman cities surprisingly relatable. But eventually darkness arrived, and everything changed. Slowly the crowds disappeared. Shops closed. Market stalls emptied. The bathhouses quieted. Families retreated indoors. Oil lamps flickered behind shutters. And for the first time all day, silence began spreading through the city. Not complete silence. Never complete silence. Cities always breathe, even while sleeping. A dog barked somewhere. A baby cried. A horse shifted in a stable. Someone coughed through a nearby window. The city remained alive, just softer. Imagine standing alone in a Roman street around midnight, the moon hanging overhead, the massive silhouettes of temples rising into darkness, the distant smell of smoke drifting through the air. No engines, no neon signs, no traffic lights, just shadows, and the occasional sound of footsteps. Those footsteps might belong to the vigiles, Rome's night watchmen, part firefighters, part police officers, part security guards, part unfortunate people assigned to remain awake while everyone else enjoyed their beds. The vigiles patrolled throughout the night, watching for thieves, watching for trouble, most importantly, watching for fires. Ancient cities feared fire almost constantly, and for good reason. Buildings stood close together. Wood was everywhere. Open flames were everywhere. One accident could become a disaster. Entire neighborhoods could disappear before sunrise. Naturally, people worried. A lot. So while wealthy Romans slept comfortably beneath blankets, the vigilas walked endless patrols through dark streets, listening, watching, waiting. It was probably rather boring, which, for a night watchman, was excellent news. Excitement usually meant somebody's house was burning down. Let's drift forward several centuries, toward a medieval city, perhaps Paris, perhaps London, perhaps Florence. The details change. The darkness remains remarkably similar. Medieval nights were darker than most modern people can easily imagine. Truly dark. Street lighting existed in limited forms, but much of the city relied upon moonlight. Cloudy nights could transform familiar roads into mysterious passages. Every shadow seemed larger. Every sound traveled farther. And every stranger looked vaguely suspicious. Not because medieval people were paranoid, although many were, but because visibility was terrible. A medieval night watchman spent hours walking slowly through narrow streets, often carrying a lantern, sometimes carrying a spear, occasionally carrying both. His responsibilities varied. He checked gates, observed suspicious activity, reported fires, and perhaps most importantly, reminded criminals that someone was watching, at least theoretically. Whether the watchman actually prevented crime depended greatly on the watchman. Some were diligent, others were merely awake, and occasionally not even that. Historical records contain endless complaints about guards sleeping during duty. Human nature has remained remarkably consistent. Give someone a long night shift, and eventually, they start reconsidering their commitment to alertness. Yet, despite these challenges, the watch continued. Hour after hour, night after night. Imagine the strange perspective such work created. Watching thousands of people sleep, watching homes go dark one by one, watching taverns finally empty, watching dawn slowly approach. A night watchman became familiar with a city few others ever saw. The sleeping city, the quiet city, the vulnerable city. Now let's wander eastward, toward ancient China, where vast cities stretched behind enormous walls. There, too, darkness transformed. Urban life. Massive gates often closed at night. Movement became restricted. Certain districts emptied almost entirely. Officials maintained careful control over who entered and exited after dark. Order mattered. Routine mattered. Predictability mattered. The last people awake frequently included guards stationed along walls and gates. Hour after hour they stood watch, listening to distant sounds beyond the city. Wind moving through trees, dogs barking, perhaps travelers arriving late, perhaps something less welcome. Standing guard sounds romantic in stories. In reality, it often involved long periods of waiting and standing, mostly standing. A remarkable amount of history was shaped by people, standing around hoping nothing happened. Still, these guards occupied a unique position. They watched sunrise before most citizens opened their eyes. They observed the transition between night and morning, one world ending, another beginning. And there is something strangely peaceful about that image. A lone guard atop a wall, looking over rooftops, watching stars fade, listening as birds begin their morning songs. The city slowly waking beneath him, not yet noisy, not yet crowded, just beginning. Now let's visit one more city, ancient Alexandria, a place where merchants, scholars, sailors, and travelers from across the Mediterranean gathered. During the day, it bustled with activity. Ships arrived constantly. Markets overflowed. Languages mixed together. Ideas traveled alongside goods. Yet even Alexandria eventually slept. Well, mostly because sailors rarely followed normal schedules. Ports never truly rested. Someone always unloaded cargo. Someone always prepared ships. Someone always watched the harbor. Imagine being the final harbor guard awake before dawn, the sea stretching endlessly into darkness, the lighthouse glowing in the distance, gentle waves striking stone, a cool breeze carrying the scent of salt water. Far away, perhaps a ship's lantern appears, tiny and flickering, slowly approaching. The city sleeps, but commerce never entirely stops. Someone must remain awake to greet the arriving vessel. Someone must record information. Someone must manage the harbor. And so while philosophers dream and merchants snore, a handful of workers continue quietly through the night. History often focuses on emperors and generals. Yet countless cities survived because ordinary people performed. Ordinary jobs at inconvenient hours. Someone guarded the gate. Someone watched the harbor. Someone patrolled the streets. Someone stayed awake. And perhaps that's the most interesting part of tonight's story. The last person awake in an ancient city was rarely famous, rarely wealthy, rarely powerful. Nobody built statues in their honor. Nobody composed epic poems celebrating their achievements. Most historical records barely mention them. Yet every morning, thousands of people woke safely because someone else had remained awake. Someone had watched. Someone had listened. Someone had walked through dark streets while everyone else slept. Their work was quiet, repetitive, sometimes lonely, frequently overlooked, but undeniably important. And perhaps, in a strange way, they experienced the city more completely than anyone else. They knew its daytime crowds, its evening celebrations, its midnight silence, and its earliest moments of dawn. They saw every version, every mood, every transformation. As the night deepens around us, imagine standing beside one of those watchmen. No hurry, no noise, just a sleeping city beneath the stars. A lantern swaying gently in the darkness. Footsteps echoing against ancient stone. The distant cry of an owl. A cool breeze moving through empty streets. And somewhere on the horizon, the first faint hint of morning. Soon bakers will wake. Merchants will rise. Children will stumble from bed. The city will come alive once more. But not yet. For a few precious moments, the streets belong to the last person awake, the final guardian of the night, the quiet observer of sleeping civilizations. And as dawn slowly approaches, even they can finally begin thinking about rest. Because another day is coming, another noisy, crowded, complicated day, and they have earned their sleep. So let the lantern dim, let the stars fade, and let the ancient city awaken without us. For our journey through the night continues elsewhere, and stranger stories are still waiting in the darkness ahead. Part 4. What happened when ancient people got lost far from home? The sun is beginning to rise over our sleeping city. The bakers are finishing their work. The watchmen are heading home. The streets are slowly filling with life again. But tonight, or perhaps very early this morning, we're leaving the city behind entirely. We're stepping beyond the walls, beyond the roads, beyond the places marked on maps, such as they were, because our next travelers are about to. experience one of humanity's oldest and most universal fears. They are going to get lost, very, very lost. Now, in the modern world, getting lost is usually an inconvenience. Your phone loses signal. You take a wrong turn. You spend 20 minutes arguing with a navigation app that insists you're somehow driving through a lake. Eventually, however, you find your way back. Ancient people were not always so fortunate. For them, getting lost could become a life-changing event or a life-ending one, sometimes both. So settle back and let's wander into the unknown. Imagine you're a merchant traveling across the Roman Empire. It's the 2nd century. The empire stretches across thousands of miles. Roads connect cities. Trade flows steadily. Business is good, at least most of the time. You have a wagon, a few companions, some valuable goods, and enough confidence to believe everything will go according to plan, which is usually the exact moment history decides otherwise. The journey begins smoothly. You travel from town to town. You sleep in roadside inns. You complain about the weather. You complain about taxes. You complain about road conditions. Ancient travelers loved complaining about roads. Again, some traditions never disappear. Then one afternoon, a storm rolls in. The sky darkens. Rain begins falling. Landmarks vanish. Road signs become difficult to see. And somewhere along the way, your group takes a wrong turn. At first, nobody notices. Hours pass. The road narrows. The landscape looks unfamiliar. One companion insists you're heading the wrong direction. Another insists everything is fine. A third contributes absolutely nothing useful. Eventually, reality becomes unavoidable. You're lost. Not slightly lost. Not, we'll figure it out in 5 minutes, lost. Properly lost. The ancient variety. And that's when the real problem begins. Because ancient travelers possessed limited information. No maps in your pocket. No satellite images. No emergency services. No helpful voice calmly announcing, recalculating route. Just uncertainty. And uncertainty grows surprisingly quickly. The first night might not feel too alarming. People remain optimistic. Surely tomorrow will solve everything. Tomorrow often disappoints. By the second or third day, food becomes a concern. Water becomes a concern. Direction becomes a concern. Every decision suddenly matters. Should you continue forward? Turn back? Follow a river? Climb a hill? Trust the local shepherd who claims he knows the area? Ancient travelers constantly faced choices with very little information. And unfortunately, nature rarely provided instructions. Let's drift farther back in time, toward the deserts of Egypt. Here, getting lost could become extraordinarily dangerous. The desert is beautiful, silent, vast, almost dreamlike, and completely indifferent to human survival. A traveler might see familiar landmarks disappear beneath shifting sand. One wrong direction could lead farther and farther from safety. Ancient Egyptian records occasionally describe expeditions that vanished, groups sent into remote regions who simply never returned. No explanation, no dramatic conclusion, just absence, which must have been deeply unsettling. Imagine waiting for a family member who never arrives. No news, no message, no certainty, just questions. Ancient people experienced plenty of uncertainty, more than most modern societies tolerate. Sometimes travelers eventually emerged months later, sunburned, exhausted, probably smelling terrible, but alive. Others became stories, warnings repeated around campfires, examples of what happened when preparation failed, or luck disappeared, and luck mattered enormously. History often celebrates skill. Skill deserves recognition, but luck deserves more credit than it receives. Many ancient survivors succeeded partly because circumstances favored them. They met the right stranger, found the right stream, chose the correct path. A few feet one way or another could change everything. Now let's travel across the sea, because sailors experience their own unique version of being lost. And frankly, it sounds stressful. Imagine standing aboard an ancient Greek ship. Land has disappeared beyond the horizon. Water stretches endlessly in every direction. The crew relies upon stars, weather, experience, instinct, sometimes prayer. Quite a lot of prayer, actually. Navigation at sea required remarkable skill. Yet mistakes happened. Storms arrived unexpectedly. Clouds concealed stars. Currents pushed ships off course. And suddenly sailors found themselves somewhere unfamiliar. Ancient literature contains countless tales of wandering voyages. Some became legends. Some became myths. Some were probably exaggerated by sailors explaining why they arrived 3 weeks late. Human beings have always enjoyed creative excuses, but behind those stories lay genuine fear. The sea offered few second chances. Fresh water remained limited. Food remained limited. Patience remained limited. Crew members trapped together for weeks rarely became more pleasant with time. Anyone who has ever traveled with relatives can probably understand. Now imagine being separated from home not for days, but years. This happened more often than many people realize. Ancient warfare created countless lost individuals. Soldiers marched enormous distances. Empires expanded. Borders shifted. Prisoners were taken. Families became separated. Some people never found their way back. A Roman soldier stationed in Britain might spend decades far from Italy. A Persian captive might end up hundreds of miles from home. A Greek merchant might settle permanently in a foreign city after becoming stranded. Being lost didn't always mean wandering through wilderness. Sometimes it meant finding yourself in a place you never intended to stay, then remaining there. Life has a habit of doing that. You plan one thing, history provides another. Let's pause beside one particularly lonely traveler. Not a king, not a famous general, just an ordinary person, perhaps a farmer, perhaps a trader, perhaps a young man searching for opportunity. He leaves home expecting to return. Most people did. Then something changes. A storm, a war, a shipwreck, an illness, a missed caravan, and suddenly home becomes very far away. Months pass, years pass. The road back grows uncertain. Letters never arrive. Friends move on. Children grow older. Parents age. The lost traveler begins building a life elsewhere. Because what other choice exists? This quiet reality appears throughout history. Entire communities formed from people who never intended to remain where they ended up. Colonists, merchants, soldiers, refugees, explorers. Lost individuals became settlers. not through grand ambition, but through circumstance. History often moves people around in unexpected ways, and sometimes getting lost creates entirely new futures. Of course, not every story ended so gently. There were forests, immense forests, dark forests, forests capable of swallowing travelers completely. Ancient Europe contained enormous wilderness regions. Roads were limited, signposts were rare, maps varied wildly in quality. Some maps were more artistic than useful. A traveler entering unfamiliar woodland could quickly lose orientation. Trees have a remarkable tendency to look similar. One oak resembles another. One path resembles another. Hours pass. Then night arrives. Now imagine darkness without electric light. The forest becomes something entirely different. Sounds grow louder. Branches move unexpectedly. Every rustle seems important. Ancient people often filled these places with legends. Spirits, monsters, ghosts, hidden dangers, partly because human imagination thrives in darkness, and partly because real dangers already existed. Wolves, bandits, exposure, starvation. You hardly needed monsters. Reality was sufficiently intimidating. Still, many lost travelers survived through cooperation. Strangers offered help. Villages provided shelter. Guides shared knowledge. Hospitality became a survival tool. Ancient societies understood something important. Anyone could become lost. Anyone could need assistance. Today's host might become tomorrow's wanderer. And so kindness frequently appeared where least expected. Not always, but often enough to matter. As our journey continues toward dawn, we can see a curious pattern emerging. Ancient people became lost for countless reasons: storms, wars, mistakes, accidents, bad directions, overconfidence, especially overconfidence. Human beings have always possessed remarkable confidence immediately before making poor decisions. Yet, despite all the uncertainty, people kept traveling. They crossed deserts, crossed mountains, crossed seas, crossed continents, because curiosity is older than caution. The desire to see what lies beyond the horizon has always competed with common sense. And surprisingly often, curiosity wins. Perhaps that's why history contains so many stories of wanderers. People who took one road and found another. People who expected short journeys and discovered entirely different lives. People who became lost and then found something unexpected: a new home, a new community, a new purpose, or simply a story worth telling. So, as tonight's journey gently settles into silence, imagine standing on an ancient road at sunset, the destination uncertain, the horizon stretching endlessly ahead. Somewhere beyond those distant hills are travelers searching for their way home. Some will find it, some will not, and a few will discover that being. Loss can sometimes change a life more completely than arriving exactly where you intended to go. The road winds onward. The stars begin to appear, and history continues quietly into the darkness. Part 5. What was it like to be a servant in a medieval castle? The ancient road has disappeared behind us now. The wandering merchants have found places to rest. The lost travelers have settled beside their campfires. And tonight, we're heading somewhere much larger, somewhere colder, somewhere filled with stone walls, drafty corridors, smoky kitchens, endless staircases, and an astonishing number of people giving orders. We're going to a medieval castle. Now, when most people imagine castles, they picture kings, queens, noble feasts, grand banquets, shining armor, colorful banners fluttering dramatically in the wind. And certainly, those things existed, occasionally. But castles were not simply homes for nobles. They were enormous workplaces, entire miniature communities, and the vast majority of people living inside them were not wealthy aristocrats. They were servants, hundreds of them, sometimes more, people whose names history rarely bothered to record, people who cooked the meals, cleaned the rooms, carried the water, lit the fires, scrubbed the floors, fed the animals, washed the clothing, and generally prevented the entire castle from descending into chaos, which, given the circumstances, was a full-time challenge. So settle in, pull the blankets a little closer, and let's spend a day in the life of a medieval castle servant. Unfortunately for us, that day begins very early. Very, very early. The servant's day often started before sunrise, long before, while the lord of the castle remained comfortably asleep beneath heavy blankets. Servants were already moving through dark hallways carrying candles and lanterns. The castle was quiet, mostly, except for the occasional snoring noble, and there were probably quite a few of those. Medieval castles were not peaceful places. People slept in groups. Servants slept in crowded quarters. Guards slept near their posts. Visitors occupied spare rooms. The sounds of dozens or hundreds of people filled the building. Privacy was not a major feature of medieval architecture. Our servant wakes up on a simple mattress, or perhaps a pile of straw. Not especially comfortable, but after enough exhaustion, almost anything becomes comfortable. The first task of the morning might be lighting fires. This sounds simple. It was not. A castle required constant heat, constant cooking, constant hot water. Fireplaces needed attention throughout the day. And without modern conveniences, creating and maintaining fire required real effort. Imagine climbing cold stone staircases before dawn carrying wood. Your hands already numb from the morning chill. Your stomach still empty. Your workday already underway. And sunrise hasn't even arrived yet. Naturally, things improve very little from there. Let's wander into the kitchens, one of the busiest places in the castle. The kitchens are already alive with activity. Smoke fills the air. Large pots bubble over open flames. Cooks shout instructions. Apprentices rush back and forth. Someone drops something heavy. Someone else immediately gets blamed for it. The usual workplace experience, just with more chickens. A noble feast might require dozens of workers, sometimes hundreds. Animals needed preparing. Bread needed baking. Vegetables needed preparing. Bread needed baking. Vegetables needed chopping. Sauces needed stirring. Everything happened by hand. No electric mixers. No refrigerators. No convenient grocery deliveries. Every meal represented an enormous amount of labor, and servants performed most of it. Imagine preparing food for an entire castle, not for a family, not for a restaurant, for hundreds of people, every single day, no weekends, no vacation days, no online reviews, thankfully, though nobles certainly had opinions, and they were often eager to share them. Meanwhile, elsewhere in the castle, Another servant begins hauling water. Now, this may not sound particularly dramatic, but water was one of the castle's greatest challenges. People needed water constantly for drinking, cooking, washing, cleaning, brewing, animals, everything. Yet water did not magically appear from a faucet. Someone had to fetch it, carry it, store it, then carry more. Imagine climbing endless staircases with heavy buckets. Again and again and again, the castle seems determined to place every important room as far from the water source as possible. Perhaps architects secretly disliked servants. It's difficult to rule out. Now let's follow a young chamber servant. Their responsibility involves cleaning noble rooms, making beds, sweeping floors, emptying waste, and attempting to keep everything respectable. This sounds manageable until you remember that medieval cleanliness operated under somewhat different standards. People bathed, contrary to popular myths, but not with modern frequency. Laundry required immense effort. Dust appeared everywhere. Smoke stained walls. Animals occasionally wandered indoors. Life was messy. A servant spent much of the day battling dirt, and dirt usually won, at least temporarily. The nobles themselves often contributed to the problem. A lord might track mud through freshly cleaned rooms. A visiting knight might arrive after weeks on horseback. Children, of course, remained children, royal or otherwise, and children possess a unique ability to create disorder faster than adults can remove it. This appears to be a universal law. Now the morning is advancing. The castle has fully awakened. Nobles begin eating breakfast. Meetings begin. Business begins. And servants become almost invisible. Not literally invisible. That would be useful, but socially invisible. A good servant was expected to be present when needed, absent when not, quiet, efficient, unobtrusive. Imagine spending your day surrounded by powerful people while pretending not to notice them. It required skill and patience, lots of patience. Some servants spent years mastering court etiquette, knowing precisely when to speak, when to bow, when to leave. One mistake could create embarrassment, and embarrassment was something medieval nobles took surprisingly seriously. A spilled drink might become a memorable disaster. A forgotten task might lead to punishment. A poorly timed interruption could haunt a servant for months or longer, because castles had excellent memories when mistakes were involved. Success, meanwhile, often went unnoticed, which feels familiar enough to many modern workers. As afternoon approaches, the pace rarely slows. There are clothes to mend, horses to care for, messages to deliver, guests to accommodate, firewood to chop, furniture to repair. The list never ends. A medieval castle was like a small city squeezed into a stone fortress. Everything required maintenance. Everything required labor. And labor required people, many of whom were exhausted, particularly the servants working outdoors. Imagine tending animals during winter, or repairing walls during rain, or cleaning stables during any season whatsoever. The stables were rarely anybody's favorite destination, for reasons we can probably leave to the imagination. Now let's climb upward, toward the Great Hall, the social heart of the castle. By evening, this enormous room begins filling with activity. Torches flicker, food arrives, conversations begin, musicians perform, nobles gather. The feast is underway. From the Lord's perspective, this may seem delightful. From the servant's perspective, it represents several hours of nonstop work. Trays must be carried, drinks refilled, spills cleaned, requests answered, problems solved, all while remaining polite, even when guests become difficult. And some guests always became difficult. Feasts encouraged enthusiasm. Enthusiasm encouraged drinking. And drinking occasionally encouraged questionable behavior. Servants witnessed all of it. Arguments, boasting, political schemes, family disputes, embarrassing mistakes. They observed history unfolding from the edges of the room, close enough to hear everything, far enough away to receive none of the credit or blame, usually, though not always. As darkness settles outside, many nobles retire for the evening. The servant's day, however, isn't finished. Not yet. Rooms need preparing. Candles need replacing. Doors need securing. Fires need checking. Animals need feeding. Tomorrow's work must already begin, because tomorrow will arrive very quickly, and it will look remarkably similar to today. This is perhaps the most important thing to understand about medieval servants. Their lives revolved around repetition, not glory, not adventure, not dramatic battles, just work, steady work, necessary work, the kind of labor that allowed everyone else to pursue more interesting activities. History often remembers kings because they issued commands. But commands accomplish very little without people willing to carry them out. Castles depended upon servants just as surely as they depended upon walls. Without cooks, people starved. Without cleaners, conditions deteriorated. Without stable workers, transportation failed. Without countless ordinary individuals, noble life became impossible. Yet most servants remain anonymous, their names lost, their stories forgotten, which is unfortunate because they were the people who actually kept the castle running, not the lord seated at the high table, not the knight boasting about tournaments, not the visiting noble discussing politics, the servant carrying water, the cook tending the fire, the maid cleaning rooms, the stable hand feeding horses. Those were the people holding everything together, quietly, patiently, every single day, and perhaps that's why their lives feel strangely familiar. Most people throughout history have not been kings. Most people have simply been workers, doing necessary jobs, solving ordinary problems, trying to get through another day. The setting changes, the clothing changes, the technology changes, but the experience often remains surprisingly recognizable. So as tonight's journey comes to a gentle close, imagine the castle finally settling into silence. The feast is over. The torches burn low. The nobles sleep behind heavy doors. And somewhere deep within the stone corridors, a tired servant finishes one last task before resting, knowing that in only a few short hours, the entire routine will begin again. The fires will need lighting. The water will need carrying. The floors will need sweeping. And the castle will once again depend upon people history rarely remembers, the quiet workers of the medieval world, keeping the lights on, or at least the candles burning, as another long night drifts softly into morning. Part 6. Who were the loneliest people in medieval Europe? The castle has finally gone quiet. The servants are asleep. The fires have burned low. The great hall sits empty beneath dark wooden beams. And tonight, we're leaving the crowded world behind. No bustling markets, no noisy feasts, no packed city streets. Instead, we're wandering toward the edges of medieval society, toward forests, mountains, remote islands, lonely towers, and tiny stone cells where some people spent years with almost no company at all. Because despite the common image of medieval Europe as a world of crowded villages and busy castles, there were also people who lived in astonishing isolation. Some chose it, others did not, and many spent their lives in places where a conversation with another human being became a rare and treasured event. So settle in, pull the blankets a little closer, and let's meet some of the loneliest people in medieval Europe. We'll begin with the hermits, the medieval masters of solitude. Now, a hermit was not necessarily someone society rejected. In fact, many were deeply respected. These were men and women who deliberately left ordinary life behind. No family dinners, no village gossip, no crowded festivals, no endless discussions about whose cow had wandered into whose field. Instead, they withdrew into isolation. Some settled in forests, some lived in caves, others occupied tiny huts built beside roads or churches. A few found homes in places so remote that visitors needed considerable determination simply to reach them. Imagine spending years in a small wooden shelter, the nearest village several miles away, the forest stretching endlessly around you. No books for entertainment, no radio, no music streaming from a phone, no sudden messages demanding immediate replies. Just silence. Lots and lots of silence. At first, this may sound peaceful, and occasionally it was. But human beings are social creatures. Even the most independent person usually wants some company eventually. A conversation, a familiar face, a reminder that the rest of humanity still exists. Hermits often received visitors seeking advice or blessings, but those visits could be infrequent. Days might pass without seeing anyone, sometimes weeks. The seasons became companions. The weather became entertainment. A particularly interesting bird might become the highlight of the week, which sounds surprisingly charming. For a while, then winter arrives. Winter changes everything. A medieval winter in isolation could feel endless. Snow covers the landscape. Roads become difficult. Travel slows dramatically. Visitors disappear. The world shrinks. The hermit remains alone with thoughts, prayers, and whatever food has been stored. And thoughts have a tendency to grow louder in silence. Anyone who has spent too much time alone understands this. The mind becomes a very active place. Now let's drift farther north, toward the rugged islands scattered around Scotland, places where isolation reached extraordinary levels. One small island, one stone chapel, one solitary monk. That was sometimes the entire population. Imagine waking every morning surrounded by ocean, the horizon stretching endlessly in every direction, storms rolling across gray water, ships appearing only occasionally. There are days when nobody visits, weeks when nobody visits. The sea becomes your nearest neighbor, and the sea, while beautiful, is not especially talkative. Medieval monks often sought these remote locations intentionally. They believed solitude brought them closer to God, and perhaps it did, but it also brought cold winds, difficult living conditions, and an astonishing lack of conversation. Some monks spent decades in these isolated communities. Decades. long enough to watch generations come and go on the mainland, long enough to see entire political conflicts unfold from a distance, long enough to become part of the landscape itself. Visitors occasionally describe these men as calm and wise, though perhaps after 20 years on a remote island, anyone would appear mysterious, simply because nobody had enough information to argue otherwise. Now let's move toward another lonely occupation, one that involved considerably less spiritual reflection. The lighthouse keeper. Although medieval lighthouses were not as common as later examples, various coastal beacons and signal towers required caretakers, and those caretakers often lived very isolated lives. Imagine standing atop a rocky coastline, night after night, watching waves crash below, keeping watch for ships, maintaining fires or signals. The work mattered enormously. Lives depended upon it. Yet much of the job consisted of waiting, watching, waiting some more, and occasionally battling weather that seemed personally offended by your existence. Storms could last days, sometimes weeks. The keeper remained at the post regardless, because ships still needed guidance, and somebody had to provide it. The sea never cared whether you felt lonely. Responsibilities remained responsibilities. Let's continue our journey, this time toward medieval castles again, but not the grand halls we visited previously. We're heading upward, into towers, because some of the loneliest people in medieval Europe were prisoners, particularly high-status prisoners. Now, this may sound strange. After all, prisons contain other people, but elite prisoners were often isolated deliberately. A captured noble, a troublesome relative, a rival claimant to a throne. Such individuals might spend years confined alone, not necessarily in dark dungeons. That image is sometimes exaggerated. Many occupied reasonably comfortable rooms. The problem wasn't comfort. The problem was isolation. Imagine spending 10 years in a tower. The same walls, the same window, the same small routine. Every day nearly identical. The outside world continues moving. Kings rise and fall. Wars begin and end. Children grow up. Entire generations pass. And you remain in the same room, looking through the same narrow opening, waiting. History contains numerous examples. Princes, dukes, claimants, political hostages, people who became inconvenient. Medieval governments often struggled to decide what to do with inconvenient relatives. Exile was one option, execution another, and sometimes they simply locked someone away and hoped everybody forgot. Remarkably, this occasionally worked, though it must have felt deeply unpleasant from the prisoner's perspective. Now let's step away from nobles entirely, toward one of the most overlooked lonely figures in medieval society, the village widow. History books rarely focus on her, which is unfortunate, because widows often experienced profound isolation. Medieval life revolved around family and community. When a spouse died, the loss was not merely emotional. It changed everything: economic stability, social position, daily routines, future expectations. A widow might continue living in the same village, surrounded by familiar faces, yet still feel completely alone. Loneliness does not require physical isolation. Sometimes it appears in crowded places. This has always been true. The widow still attends church, still visits markets, still sees neighbors, but the person who shared everyday life is gone. The silence inside the home becomes noticeable, then unavoidable, then permanent. Countless medieval people experienced this reality. Most left no written records, yet their loneliness was every bit as real as that of hermits or prisoners. Now let's drift into the forests once more, because medieval Europe also contained foresters, hunters, and wardens responsible for enormous stretches of wilderness. Some spent weeks away from settlements, tracking animals, protecting land, monitoring resources. Their work required independence and patience, lots of patience. Imagine sitting alone beneath trees for hours, listening to wind move through branches, watching deer emerge cautiously from the undergrowth. The forest becomes both workplace and companion, beautiful, peaceful, and occasionally unsettling, especially at night. Medieval forests carried powerful reputations. Stories filled them with bandits, spirits, wolves, and mysterious dangers. Some of those fears were exaggerated, others were not. A lone forest worker understood that help might be very far away. If trouble arrived, self-reliance became essential, and self-reliance often comes bundled with loneliness. As the night deepens, let's consider an unexpected group: kings, queens, and rulers. Now wait, that sounds ridiculous. How can someone surrounded by hundreds of servants feel lonely? Yet many rulers did. Power creates distance. People tell you what you want to hear. People hide their true opinions. People treat the crown rather than the person. A king might dine among dozens of nobles and still wonder who genuinely cared about him. A queen might attend magnificent ceremonies and still lack a trusted friend. Royal loneliness appears repeatedly throughout history. The higher someone climbed, the fewer honest relationships often remained. It's one of history's quieter tragedies, and perhaps one of its most universal, because loneliness isn't measured by the number of people around you. It's measured by connection, by understanding, by companionship, and those things can disappear even in crowded rooms. As our journey slowly approaches its end, we find ourselves surrounded by all these different lonely lives: the hermit in the forest, the monk on the island, the lighthouse keeper beside the sea, the prisoner in the tower, the widow in the village, the forester beneath the trees, the king upon the throne. Different lives, different circumstances, yet all connected by a common experience: the feeling of being separated from others, of standing slightly apart from the world, sometimes by choice, sometimes by fate, sometimes by responsibilities impossible to escape. And perhaps that is why their stories still resonate, because loneliness is not uniquely medieval. Every age understands it. Every generation encounters it. The settings change. The clothing changes. The technology changes. But the human experience remains remarkably familiar. So as tonight's story gently drifts toward silence, imagine a medieval landscape beneath the stars: a distant monastery, a lonely tower, a small cottage, a lighthouse flame flickering beside the sea. Scattered across the darkness are countless individuals ending another day alone. Some content, some sorrowful, some simply accustomed to it, each carrying private thoughts into the night, while the world around them sleeps. And somewhere above, the same stars watch over them all, quietly, patiently, as history continues its slow journey into the darkness. Part 7. What happened to prisoners who survived the Roman Colosseum? The stars still hang quietly above medieval Europe. The lonely hermits have settled into sleep. The lighthouse fires flicker against distant shores. And now, as our journey continues, we're traveling much farther back in time. Back to the ancient world, back to Rome, back to one of the most famous buildings ever constructed, the Colosseum. Even today, nearly 2,000 years later, it dominates the imagination. People picture roaring crowds, gladiators clashing swords, exotic animals charging across the arena floor, emperors watching from luxurious seats. And naturally, Hollywood has spent many years making everything louder, much louder. But tonight we're not focusing on the famous champions, not the celebrated warriors whose names echoed through Rome. Instead, we're following a different group: the prisoners, the captives, the unfortunate individuals who entered the arena expecting death and somehow survived. Because occasionally, against all expectations, some of them did. The question is, what happened next? What did survival actually look like? Was freedom waiting? Fortune? A second chance? Or simply another unpleasant surprise? As it turns out, the answer was usually complicated, which is a very Roman answer. So settle in, and let's step into the shadow of the Colosseum. Imagine Rome around the 1st century AD. The city is enormous, perhaps the largest urban center many people would ever see. Its streets are crowded, its markets noisy, its public buildings magnificent, and towering above much of it stands the Colosseum, a structure built to impress and intimidate. The Romans excelled at both. On the morning of a major spectacle, thousands of people streamed toward the arena. Citizens, merchants, soldiers, visitors, everyone wanted entertainment. And Roman entertainment often involved extraordinary levels of danger. From our modern perspective, this seems alarming. To many Romans, it seemed perfectly normal. Human societies have very different ideas about leisure. Now, somewhere beneath the arena, in a maze of tunnels and chambers, prisoners wait. Some are criminals, some are captured rebels, some are prisoners of war. Some simply had the misfortune of being on the losing side of history, which, unfortunately, was a common way to become a Roman prisoner. Empires tend to produce many captives. Rome produced millions. These prisoners often arrived from distant lands: Gaul, Britain, Germany, North Africa, the Middle East. Entirely different cultures suddenly found themselves standing beneath a Roman arena, far from home, far from family, far from any future they once imagined. And for many, survival did not seem particularly likely. The games could be brutal, yet not every event guaranteed immediate death. This is one of the biggest misconceptions about Roman spectacles. The arena was dangerous, certainly, but it wasn't always a simple matter of entering and instantly dying. Roman organizers invested significant money into these events. Training people was expensive, acquiring prisoners was expensive, preparing spectacles was expensive. Rome loved drama, but Rome also appreciated efficiency. As a result, some participants survived, sometimes because they fought well, sometimes because crowds admired them, sometimes because organizers saw future value in keeping them alive, and occasionally through sheer luck. History often leaves room for luck. Imagine being one of these survivors. The crowd roars. The event ends. You are still breathing. The impossible has happened. at least for today. Now what? Well, unfortunately, survival rarely meant immediate freedom. That would have been convenient. Roman authorities were not generally known for their generosity toward captives. A surviving prisoner often returned to confinement, back underground, back to barracks, back to uncertainty. Tomorrow might bring another appearance, another contest, another test. The arena had a remarkable ability to postpone problems rather than solve them. Still, survival changed things, particularly if a prisoner demonstrated unusual skill. Some captives gradually transitioned into gladiatorial training. Now, becoming a gladiator was not exactly a dream career, but compared to certain alternatives, it offered opportunities. Gladiators received food, training, medical treatment, and occasionally fame. A strange combination. Imagine surviving because people enjoyed watching you fight. It's a peculiar path to success. Yet ancient Rome specialized in peculiar arrangements. A talented prisoner could become valuable. Valuable people are often treated differently, not necessarily well, but differently. Some gladiators became minor celebrities. Crowds recognized them, admired them, bet on them, discussed them. Poets occasionally mentioned them, which must have felt surreal. One year you're a prisoner of war. The next strangers are cheering your name. Life can take unexpected turns, even in ancient Rome. Of course, most survivors never achieved celebrity status. Most remained ordinary captives, and ordinary captives faced difficult futures. Many entered forced labor. Roman society depended heavily upon enslaved workers. Mines, quarries, farms, construction projects. The empire always needed labor. A surviving prisoner represented a useful resource, not a free citizen, not a celebrated hero, simply labor. The Romans were practical people, sometimes brutally practical. Imagine surviving the arena only to discover that years of hard labor await. It's not the triumphant ending modern stories usually prefer. Yet history rarely consults storytellers before making decisions. Now let's consider another possibility. This sounds surprising, but Rome occasionally incorporated former enemies into its forces. Not immediately, not casually, and not universally. Yet over time, some captives entered military service, particularly along distant frontiers. The empire constantly required soldiers. Borders stretched thousands of miles. Threats appeared regularly. Manpower mattered. A former prisoner who proved loyal could eventually build an entirely new life. Not common, but possible. History contains many examples of people crossing astonishing social boundaries. One chapter closes, another begins. The prisoner becomes a soldier. The outsider becomes an insider, at least partially. Now let's wander away from Rome itself, toward the provinces, because many surviving captives never returned home. How could they? The empire was vast, travel expensive, communication slow. A prisoner captured in Britain might spend the rest of life in Italy. A captive from Gaul might end up in North Africa. A rebel from Judea might find himself hundreds or thousands of miles away. Home became memory. Memory became distance. Distance became permanence. This may have been one of the saddest aspects of survival. Not death, but separation. The realization that family might never be seen again. Parents growing older somewhere beyond reach. Children growing up without you. Friends assuming you are gone forever. Ancient people experienced these losses constantly. Empires moved people around on enormous scales, and individual stories often disappeared within larger events. Yet each prisoner carried a personal history, a hometown, a language, a favorite place, a life interrupted. The arena did not erase those things, even if Rome rarely acknowledged them. As evening settles over the Colosseum, let's imagine one final survivor. Not a champion, not a famous gladiator, just an ordinary captive. Perhaps he survives because an opponent makes a mistake. Perhaps because the crowd shows mercy. Perhaps because fate decides to postpone its decision. The reasons hardly matter. What matters is that he walks out alive. For a moment, relief arrives. Powerful relief. The overwhelming gratitude of still being alive. And then reality follows. Tomorrow remains uncertain. Freedom remains distant. Home remains far away. Yet survival itself possesses value. Ancient people understood this deeply. Life did not need to be perfect to be precious. A future, however uncertain, remained preferable to no future at all. And so many survivors continued, working, training, adapting, enduring, building whatever life circumstances allowed. Because humans have always been remarkably skilled at continuing, even when the odds seem unreasonable, even when history appears indifferent, even when standing beneath the shadow of an empire. As tonight's journey gently reaches its close, the crowds begin leaving the Colosseum. The cheering fades. The arena grows quiet. Workers sweep the sand. Torches flicker against ancient stone. And somewhere among the survivors is a prisoner who expected to die that day, yet somehow did not. His future remains unclear, his freedom uncertain, his journey unfinished. But for one more night, he remains alive. And sometimes, in the ancient world, that alone was an extraordinary victory. The great arena falls silent. The city settles into darkness, and history continues onward, carrying its survivors with it. Part 8. How did ancient people survive long, boring winters? The crowds have finally left the Colosseum. The arena lies silent beneath the moonlight. The surviving prisoners have disappeared into the vast machinery of the Roman world. And tonight, as our journey continues, we're leaving behind emperors, gladiators, and great cities. Instead, we're traveling somewhere much quieter, somewhere colder, somewhere where time itself seems to slow down. We're going into winter, not a modern winter, not a winter filled with central heating, streaming services, electric blankets, hot showers, and the ability to order almost anything with a few taps on a screen. Ancient winter was a very different experience. For many people, it was the longest part of the year, not because the season was actually longer, but because it often felt longer, much longer. The fields stopped producing. Travel became difficult. The days grew short. The nights stretched endlessly. And for months at a time, ordinary people found themselves trapped between darkness and cold. So settle in, pull the blankets a little closer, and let's spend a winter with the ancient world. Imagine a small village somewhere in northern Europe. The year is difficult to identify. It could be Roman. It could be medieval. It could be almost any century before the modern age. Because winter changed surprisingly little for ordinary people. The first snow has arrived. The harvest is finished. Animals have been brought closer to home. The final preparations are complete. And now everyone waits. That waiting was one of winter's defining features. For much of the year, life revolved around movement, planting, building, traveling, trading, harvesting. Winter interrupted all of it. Nature effectively announced that business hours were temporarily reduced, and there was very little anyone could do about it. The village becomes quieter, roads grow muddy, then frozen. Travelers become rare. Merchants appear less often. Visitors disappear almost entirely. The world shrinks. For many people, it shrinks dramatically. A farmer who spent summer working vast fields might now spend most days within sight of the same few buildings, the same neighbors, the same animals, the same stretch of frozen landscape, again and again, for months. Which brings us to an important question. How did people avoid becoming completely bored? The answer is that boredom itself was somewhat different in the ancient world. Modern boredom often appears when entertainment disappears. Ancient boredom usually appeared after work was completed, and work never entirely disappeared. There was always something needing attention. Tools required repair. Clothing required mending. Wood needed chopping. Food needed preserving. Equipment needed maintenance. The tasks changed, but the tasks remained. Imagine sitting beside a fire on a dark winter evening. Outside, snow falls steadily. Inside, family members repair clothing by candlelight. Someone carves wood. Someone spins wool. Someone prepares tomorrow's meal. Nobody is rushing. Nobody is multitasking. The pace is slow, almost hypnotically slow. Hours pass this way, not because people particularly enjoy sewing, but because winter provides time for activities impossible during busier seasons. Many essential household items were created during these long evenings. Shirts, blankets, ropes, baskets, tools. Winter became a season of production, just a different kind. Of course, eventually, even productive people need entertainment. And fortunately, humans have always excelled at inventing ways to pass time. Stories became enormously important. In fact, winter may have been history's greatest storytelling season. Imagine gathering around a fire after sunset. The wind rattles against walls. The darkness outside feels endless. And someone begins telling a story. Perhaps it's a local legend, a family tale, a ghost story, a heroic adventure, or perhaps a story that has already been told 50 times. That hardly matters. People still listen. Before books became common, stories served many purposes: entertainment, education, memory, community. A good storyteller could transform an ordinary winter evening into something memorable. Entire generations learned history this way, not from textbooks, from voices, from repetition, from nights spent beside the fire. And honestly, that sounds rather pleasant, at least for the first few weeks. By February, opinions may have varied. Now let's drift toward ancient Scandinavia, a region where winter possessed particularly impressive ambitions. Long nights, cold temperatures, limited daylight, the sort of conditions that encourage people to stay indoors whenever possible. Here, storytelling became almost an art form. The Norse sagas preserved memories of voyages, feuds, heroes, disasters, and extraordinary personalities. Many of these stories survived because people spent countless winter evenings repeating them again and again. A long winter creates an appreciative audience. Eventually, nearly everyone knows the stories, yet they continue listening anyway. This is another deeply human habit. People enjoy familiar stories, especially during uncertain times. The ending is known. The characters are familiar. The experience feels comforting. Ancient people understood comfort perfectly well. They simply had fewer ways to obtain it. Now let's move southward, toward the Roman world. Winters here were generally milder, though not always pleasant. Romans spent winters somewhat differently. Urban life continued. Cities remained,